One question I have, I don't know about you, but for me, unlike with the Soviet Union, and I know I was born there, but even outside of that, the cultural gap, the loss in translation, the communication gap between China and the United States seems to be much greater than that of what was the former Soviet Union and the United States. I see two cultures intermingling and communicating as one of the ways to de-escalate future conflict.
It's an interesting question. I mean, it is sort of an abstract theoretical level. My argument is that great powers act according to realist dictates, and they understand those realist dictates, and that can lead to cooperation or it can lead to war. It depends. I would say just in the case of the Soviets, a lot of people describe the Cold War as an ideological competition above all else. It was communism versus liberal democracy or communism versus liberal capitalism, whatever. I actually don't believe that. I believe the Soviets were realists to the core. I believe Stalin was a realist par excellence. And that ideology did not matter much in Stalin's foreign policy. And I believe if you look at Soviet foreign policy after World War II, throughout the Cold War, they were realists to the core. And I think in those days, the Americans were realists, right? A lot of liberal ideology floating around out there, but the Americans were realists. And I think one of the reasons you avoided a shooting match between the United States and the Soviet Union from 47 to 89 was because both sides, I think, understood basic balance of power logic. U.S.-China competition is somewhat different. First of all, the Chinese are realists to the core. I've spent a lot of time in China. I basically have rock and roll. I'm basically a rock and roll star in China. The Chinese,
You're kind of a big deal in China. I love it.
the Chinese are my kind of people.
Yeah.
They're realists, right? They
Yeah.
speak my language.
Yeah.
It's the United States that is not very realist.
Yeah.
American leaders have a very powerful liberal bent and tend not to see the world in realist terms. I believe, by the way, just going back to our discussion of NATO expansion, I think our inability to understand that NATO expansion was anathema to the Russians, was due in large part to the fact that we just, during the unipolar moment, didn't think of international politics from a realist perspective and didn't respect anyone who thought about international politics from a realist perspective. If those various American administrations, starting with the Clinton administration, had put their realist hat on, they would have understood that NATO expansion into Ukraine was not a good idea. But we had this thoroughly liberal view of the world that dominated our thinking. And it's gone away somewhat since we've moved into multipolarity, but not completely. And this makes me a little nervous, right, to pick up on your point. I mean, the United States is thinking about the world in ways that are somewhat different than the Chinese, who are realists par excellence.
So that's fascinating. So the Chinese are pragmatic about thinking of the world in as a competition of military powers, all the ways in which you described the realist perspective. So that's a hopeful thing, right? If we can achieve stability and a balance of powers through that military competition.
Yeah, I actually think that's right. I think if the United States, just let me talk a little bit about the United States to get at the issue you're raising. If the United States pursues a smart containment strategy, given what you just said and I said about the Chinese, I think we will avoid war. The problem with the Americans is it's not just the liberalism. It's the possibility that we will pursue a rollback policy. In other words, during the Cold War, We pursued containment. It was whenever anybody talked about American grand strategy towards the Soviet Union, it was containment, containment, containment.
Mm.
We now know from the historical record that the United States was not only pursuing containment, it was pursuing rollback. We were trying to roll back Soviet power.
Mhm.
To put it bluntly, we were trying to wreck the Soviet Union. Okay. And I would not be surprised moving forward with regard to China if the United States pursues a serious rollback policy.